Green and brown in the compost bin when you're short on green. This was updated on July 2nd, 2015, and appears in the organic gardening section, which is a subset of gardening, which is a subset of home. Alternate layers of brown and green. Ideally, a compost pile would have twice as much green as brown. This has to do with carbon's presence and its interaction with nitrogen. Even when plant materials have needed minerals in them, the trick is to get the nutrients into a usable form. This is why people add inoculants when planting beans as nitrogen fixers. When carbon and nitrogen work together, a large amount of material in a compost pile can break down quickly. The resulting compost is high quality, moist, dark, crumbly, and free of former impurities which have been cooked out of it. This hub, as in others I've contributed, is about how to garden in less than ideal circumstances. I just don't have enough green matter to make up 2/3 of the pile. Back when I lived in the Midwest, this was no problem, as lawn clippings were easy to get. All I had to do was mow lushly growing grass, which seemed to get taller by the minute. But I live near the ocean now, and while it's beautiful, and I am glad I moved, there just isn't all that green grass of home. Here, a few blocks from Casco Bay, the air is salty, the temperatures are cool, and the soil is sandy. What we have for grass is a tough, tufty, beachy grass that I'm digging up and replacing with perennials because it's so hard to mow. Also, the houses are close together in New England with little postage stamp lawns, and that half-acre lot you see everywhere in roomier spaces, we don't have that. So I can't just do what I used to do in Ohio or Indiana. Take the bag off the back of the power mower and dump it all over the leaves I raked up last fall. Not only do I not have enough green, I have way more brown than I need. As my starting point, I have 3 times as much brown as green. What I lack in grass clippings, I have in fallen maple leaves. Trees, yes, and lawn, no. I do love trees, and it's not that I want a lawn anyway, but that's a discussion that I've already brought up on another hub. So today I'm writing about how I do my best to make up the difference in green and brown ratios so that my carbon-nitrogen mix is closer to optimal and my compost is of better quality. Here I have a caption under the picture of my grass whip, and I say, doesn't this look like a golf club? I use this grass whip to cut non-weed grass to get green manure since I don't have enough lawn to mow. Down with the brown, up with the green. For a better ratio for the compost, I need to do something with the brown leaves besides put all of them into the compost pile. Yes, the city will take bagged leaves once a year if I put them out on the right day. But then I would have to buy the bags. I don't want to do that. And then put the leaves into the bags. I don't want to do that either. And my goal is to make our life, including the gardening and food production and eating of that food, more of a self-sustaining circle. I want to take what we already have, upcycle it into a higher level resource, and use that to create more of what we need here. But there's only so much I can do with all the brown leaves. So once those are repurposed in the ways described later in this post, my next step is to find new sources of green. I could go outside the tiny Maine homestead to seek out what I need, but again, I want to use what I have. I've written another hub on the topic of green manure made from cover crops, and these plants are the type of material I add to the compost pile to bring the brown-green ratio into better proportion. Next, I have a picture or a series of pictures about using brown leaves in the bottom of an oversized container to put a 4-inch starter pot of basil into this large container. The first caption says, "This basil needs to go into a bigger pot as its original 4-inch pot is starting to get root bound." Okay, do I have everything? Basil, check. Potting soil, check. New pot, check. Next is a picture of the large pot and the small plant next to it, which says mismatch. Small plant, big pot. Now there's a picture of the large pot which is partially filled with brown, crisp leaves that are not composted. I filled the overlarge container about 1/3 of the way with crunchy, springy leaves. It's the same idea as when people put empty plastic bottles in to take up extra volume in a planter. The next picture in this series is half a bag of potting soil. I added the basil and a bit more potting mix to hold the plant in place. By using leaves at the bottom before adding dirt, I've saved a lot of soil mix to use for other growing purposes. And last in the series is a nice picture of the basil, which is doing very well, has gotten much bigger, and has made some large leaves and is branching out. And it says, "This photo was taken a week or so after I put the basil into its new container, filled with the soil maple leaf mix, and it's thriving." Too much brown? Not sure what to do with it? Idea number 1. On television gardening shows, the people doing the how-to segments always have the correct size container for whatever vegetable or herb or flower needs repotting. In my actual life, that only happens maybe half the time. I often find myself putting a root-bound plant or a new seedling into a container too deep for it, as my other option is to use one that's too small or too shallow, and that wouldn't do at all. In the past, I have filled the container with potting soil, which works fine, but has the double problem of wasting money. Dirt is not really dirt cheap, is it? And wasted soil that's down below the roots that will never touch it. And wasted soil means soil I had to buy, carry, mix, trowel in, and all that. My solution is to use brown crunchy leaves from the top of the compost pile as volumizer in the bottom of the oversized pot. The leaves are springy, porous, cost nothing, and are lighter than the soil mix would be, so the planter, when full, is not so heavy. Idea number 2 for too much brown. Another thing brown leaves can do is to help make dirt lasagna. For this soil building technique, unlike using the leaves as pot fillers, the uncomposted material works better when wet. So before I begin layering my extra maple leaves between layers of dirt, mulch, and cardboard, I turn the garden hose on the leaf pile, or I dump the leaves into a plastic bin and pour in a couple 5-gallon icing buckets full of water. My beans are planted in a no-dig garden bed I made by layering wet brown leaves, wet brown cardboard, and a mix of soil, black crumbly compost from the bottom of my bin. The beans are flourishing. Over the next couple of growing seasons, I will add more layers of leaves, compost, and cardboard to deepen the soil mix created by the lasagna method, so I can grow root crops in the bed. Using brown leaves idea number 3 as a loose mulch. I don't like to weed corn. I have 3 small garden plots on our tiny Maine homestead, and one of them is a raised bed I built on part of our driveway. 2 of the plots have corn planted in long rows, as is done in the traditional method. But the raised bed, which is a large square about 5 feet on each side, has the plants spaced about a foot apart from each other in each direction, a little like the way you lay out your 3 rows of checkers when you're about to start playing the game. In the raised bed, I have the corn planted in about 1.5 feet of soil mix, And then I mulched around the corn stalks with another 6 or 8 inches of brown leaves. So far I've used a couple bushels of leaves, and as the corn grows taller and as rain compacts the leaf mulch, I will add another bushel or 2 or 3. Next, I have a photograph of this raised bed with a corn stalk in the corner, which is small. Brown leaves are working for me as mulch for my sweet corn. These are baby plants. Since I took this photo, the corn plants are now sturdy, about 18 inches tall, with nice shiny leaves. More green in your, well, not in your pocket. That would be silly. Your pocket's not big enough, at least not at the literal level. How much green compost could you fit in one of those? Of course, on the metaphorical level, if you can get your level of green compost up to twice the level of brown compost, and without spending much money, then the pocket idea makes sense. The main sources for the supplemental green layer I need for the compost bin are various forms of ground cover crops. I have 2 main ones I use. When it comes to saving money, both are a good deal. Clover seeds itself and comes back for several years without me having to buy more clover seed. Buckwheat does need to be reseeded annually, but it makes a lot of kernels at the top of each stalk. These kernels are the seeds I plant. They are so easy to harvest and remove from the stalks that I can have all the buckwheat seed I need for the following year in about 15 minutes, including the first step of pulling up the buckwheat plants, all the way to the final step of putting the hard, dark, 3-sided kernels into an upcycled junk mail envelope and labeling that buckwheat with the current growing year. All that in a quarter hour. Done, and no money laid out after the first planting of buckwheat seed. The next photo series is titled Clover Makes a Great Cover Crop, and the photo is a clover bed which is about 3 feet wide, about 15 to 20 feet long, and the clover in it is about knee height. Clover is not exactly perennial, says the caption, but it comes back without reseeding for up to 10 years. The next picture says clover gets nice and tall, and I can cut the top growth and leave the plants to grow. Then there's a picture of a pretty clover flower with leaves around it on the stalk, and it says, "It's a bonus when the green manure is really a pretty flowering plant, much better than the scraggly grass that was half growing with many weeds along the foundation of our house." The next picture is captioned Cut Clover Added as a Green Layer, and there are 2 photos of the clover stalks cut. They're about 2 feet long, and they are laid on top of the brown leaves in the round wire cylinder that holds the compost. And the caption is, "After cutting a foot or 2 of clover stalks off the tops of the clover bed, I added them to make a slightly inadequate green layer on top of brown leaves in the wire cylinder bin." Buckwheat does double, triple, even quadruple duty. Buckwheat is not a grain, but it looks like one. It is fast growing, not picky about growing conditions, and it makes pretty flowers. It produces plenty of grain-like seeds that I save to plant the following year, and it helps the soil hold nitrogen. When planted thickly, it will crowd out weeds. If I need the kernels, I wait till the end of the growing season and pull the plants up in the late summer. But if I want to use the space for fall crops, I can pull the buckwheat up any time and toss the green stalks onto the compost pile for an excellent green layer, and then plant something else right where the buckwheat grew an hour before. Next, there's a photo of a nice carpet of buckwheat, very early. It's only 6 inches tall, but it's very green and vibrant. And the caption is, "Buckwheat is useful and nice to look at." In a few weeks, these plants will become 12 or 14 inches tall, then develop flowers. At the end of the season, the buckwheat will develop clusters of dark pointed kernels at the top. Corn also helps me by growing in my attic. I had leftover seed corn this year. I saved 4 or 5 ears from last year, and after I had all the plantable space filled with sweet corn, there were still a few dozen kernels left. I don't have backyard poultry yet. I hope to raise chickens next year. So here I had this soaked corn, and I decided to use the light at the ends of my attic where the eaves are, because there are 2 medium-sized windows at each end of our 1930s cottage-style home. I planted the corn in white plastic dishpans from the dollar store. I often use these as containers to grow culinary and medicinal herbs, as well as in cardboard lids from copier paper boxes. The little corn plants got to be about 6 or 8 inches tall with nice bright green leaves. I watered them daily, and when they got as large as they could get in the shallow containers, I uprooted them and added them as a green layer in the mesh cylinder filled with the mostly brown compost. The next caption shows a rather dim light in my attic, but a very vibrant green corn shoot coming up in the corner of a cardboard box filled with dirt. And then there is a second box where second picture where we see the whole box, and they look a little tired, but it is filled with green shoots of corn at the end of their growth that they could do up there. This is the very last of the leftover corn, says the caption, sprouted in a shallow container. The attic was starting to get too warm for the sprouts, so I knew I was done with this free green manure for the spring season. Compost in a free pile versus in the hardware cloth cylinder. Here at the tiny Maine homestead, there are 5, count 'em 5, compost areas. There's a wet compost bucket with a snap-down lid, and that holds vegetable and fruit peels and eggshells and other food scraps that skunks, raccoons, and dogs would like to get into. There's a second commercially made plastic bin, also with a lid, near the back fence. That one has food scraps, which are more dry and have less food sugar or odor, which would attract the furry creatures. Into that bin go the tough broccoli stems, rubbery outer leaves from heads of cabbage, things like that. Then there's the free pile of compost, which is in a spot near the shed behind our garage. This is where I pile the bad compost, meaning mostly weeds. I do want the benefit of the green leaves, but I don't want the seeds from those weeds to germinate with the good compost. By piling this green matter in a cone-shaped heap right on the warm ground, I am taking away any ventilation and letting the sun's heat soak into the weed leaves and stems, all matted together and then matted to the ground, where the warm soil will continue to cook the compost for an hour or 2 after the sun goes down each summer night. The intense heat in the pile will be too much for the weed seeds, and they won't be likely to grow when the wilted green mass is added to make a greenish layer in the good compost. The 4th compost pile is the central compost area, and it's where all the other compost will eventually go when it finishes in one of the other piles. This pile is silo-shaped, and it is formed inside a cylinder I created by rolling a section of hardware cloth, which is like chicken wire but sturdier with rectangular openings, into the circumference I wanted. I fastened the cylinder together with plastic cable ties. I can snip the ties with scissors and reform the cylinder if I want it larger or smaller in diameter. There's no bottom to the cylinder, so when it's full I can just pull the whole thing straight up and move it to a new location to start a new pile. Or I can use a garden fork to loosen the pile and then refill the cylinder in its new spot, taking what was on the top and putting it on the bottom, and continuing until the uncomposted stuff from near the bottom of the old pile is now on the top. The very bottom layer is the completely composted stuff, black and crumbly, and it's ready to add to the garden soil. The cylinder is where I put the brown and green layers of parfait to make the finished compost. It does not get as hot as a pile on the ground does because the crinkly leaves in the brown layer are looser and let air through. When it rains, the leaves get wet and stick together more, so the pile moves down, but overall the pile does not heat up as much as the pile on the ground. Since I have all that brown stuff to move through the system, I salt each brown layer with Compost Quick, which is a granular microbial product you can buy at the hardware store or lawn and garden center. The microbes help the good bacteria break down the leaves to compost faster, which is good because the fifth compost pile is brown overflow. I don't want to put all brown into the cylinder because I need to put green in between, and sometimes I don't have green at the moment. So there's always a pile of brown leaves raked up against the backyard fence, like people outside a sold-out concert searching for ticket scalpers. If I bagged the brown leaves in black trash bags and added some more Compost Quick, they'd break down faster, but then I'd have to do all that, and also I'm not sure I want the black plastic chemicals to leach into the compost. So I take all that brown and rake it into a pile next to the stockade fence, and I wait for the green to come in, like the Thursday night before a payday. The next photo series is titled Naughty versus Nice Compost. No weeds got into the wire bin. There's a picture of the cylinder made of hardware cloth. Here's a nice new pile of good compost made of alternate brown leaves and green clippings, green manure. I pulled the cylinder up from around the last pile and moved it to a new spot to start the second pile of the good stuff. Weeds in the green layer, yes or no? No, well, not right in the green layer directly. I don't want to germinate the seeds in the weeds I pulled up and mix them in with soil around my garden plants. That would be like seeding my garden with weeds, the way someone might plant a lawn. Instead, I compost green weeds in a separate pile. When the weeds have deteriorated in the sun and heat from the pile has made most of the weed seeds unviable, then I am willing to put the green bad stuff in with the rest of the good compost. Then there's a picture of the bad compost, the weed pile, and it says bad green compost turning good. Start of the new weed pile on the ground to form a foundation of a cone-shaped pile which will become hot enough to kill most weed seeds. Making up the difference with kelp powder. We live on a small lot and there's only so much space for cover crops like clover and buckwheat for my green compost fertilizer needs. And I have so many brown leaves that even I, creative soul that I am, can't think up enough uses for all of them. So my brown-green ratio will always favor brown, and I need a workaround. I have a foil bag of kelp powder I got to make a seed germinating solution, and I am thinking of adding some of this to the brown layers in the compost pile. Kelp is rich in nitrogen. When the compost is done, I will be adding worm castings to the overall soil mix, and that will have plenty of nitrogen for the plants. But I hope that the kelp might bring the carbon-nitrogen balance in the compost pile closer to the ratio where the materials break down both well and quickly. Have the opposite problem, way more green than brown? When I lived in Ohio, I had more green compost than brown. When I lived in Ohio, I had more green compost than brown. The lawn at my rented apartment grew lushly, and I had a larger garden then with a lot of green plant stalks from tomatoes and peppers, plus the stems of basil and other herbs. I didn't have any trees in my yard, and none of my neighbors' trees had branches close enough to drop a literal windfall of maple or oak leaves onto my rented property. I got brown leaves sometimes by going along the fence line of a city utility shed down the alley from my house and raking the banked up leaves into piles, which I brought home in a wheelbarrow. And the night before the weekly yard waste pickup, I would sneak out and filch a couple of those filled brown paper bags of leaves that people leave by the curb. No one ever complained. Thank you for listening to this or reading this post. I really enjoy being part of the Hub community, sharing ideas, reaching out to people that live too far away from me to connect with face to face, but whose valuable ideas about a more sustainable, permaculture, easy on the earth way of living are important to me. So I really appreciate your attention. Thank you.